Welcome everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. Today we continue our discussion of the Salon article, Why the Right is So Terrified of Woke. There are truths it just can't face. This is part 4 of this discussion, continuing, probably not concluding. We'll probably spend the rest of the week on this and wrap it up tomorrow. I'm going to quote a rather large paragraph and we're going to break it down and then we're going to go from there. The fight against woke, a term with a longer history than most of us may realize, is strikingly similar to the fight the right previously waged against political correctness. It's an existential battle against allowing people to be awakened by reading novels and history, by attending plays, by watching and listening to actual news, through open discussion of privilege or systemic racism, or, to use a different but related term, the underlying and nearly invisible structures of caste in America. It is a fight to stop people from talking about these social structures, or about a combination of religious zealotry and political ideology at work to foreclose women's bodily autonomy. It's a fight to prevent young people from expressing their sexual and gender preferences, to make it more difficult for certain groups of citizens to vote, and to keep books that might make the most hypocritical and closed-minded evangelical Christian pastors uncomfortable off the shelves of public schools and libraries. Continuing on with the theme that we've described, this is the author's way of engaging in political rhetoric that addresses his political opponents. These are people he does not agree with. And he doesn't give any credence to people who don't agree with him. He does not allow for ideological diversity at all. Essentially, it's a rather tyrannical, his way or the highway approach to politics. There's a logical fallacy that most of us are familiar with, but it's worth discussing, called a straw man. This is where you win an argument by presenting the least flattering, least persuasive version of your opponent's argument and then dismantle it. Shockingly, it's rather easy to do when you construct your opponent's argument rather poorly. If you are willing to engage in political discourse, you should be willing to see things from both sides. In my experience, there's no such thing as a one-sided issue. Every single political issue has at least two sides, and each side has at least one good argument, or else it wouldn't be a side. Take gun control, for instance. There is an argument for keeping weapons out of the hands of crazy people, because crazy people are not restrained from immoral, evil actions that harm innocent third parties. There's also an argument to be made that you have to find a way to abate the power of a government that has weapons, even worse, a monopoly on weapons. If you have a government where the government is tyrannical and it's the only entity with weapons, third-party innocent victims happen again. So both sides of that conversation have a clear, articulable case to be made. It is the sign of a political manipulator, as a best case scenario, or a weak-minded sheep if the best argument that you can bring for your opponent is to call them names or strawman them or seek to undermine their credibility preemptively. Because it's a way of saying, I don't have to argue with you about this because you don't really have a point. Your side doesn't have a point. This is a one-sided issue. And here's the challenge. In human experience, if you can't talk through an issue, it leads to violence. Some issues can be papered over. Some issues can be ignored. And there is room for tolerance in society. People should be given the benefit of the doubt. But let's take a rather extreme example. Let's look at the logical endpoint for the trans ideology. For many, many generations, society has put the onus of teaching the rising generation primarily on the parents who are raising them, with support from society. However, there is an ideologically driven push right now to shift that and say public educators, public spaces, public speakers should be able to teach young children this ideology. And if the parents disagree, society should take the children from those parents. That's where this goes. There's only one way that government knows how to accomplish its will, and that's through force. Government doesn't create any value in society. It extracts money from the taxpaying citizens or through debt from future taxpaying citizens, and there's room for that. There's a reason why society has governments. It's a good solution, kept within check. So, as an example, I want children to be educated. Perfect. Let's take tax dollars and pay for a school, and then anyone can send their kids. That way, everyone gets a basic level of education. But don't mistake what's going on here. The government is using force to enact its will to take the money to fund the school. If you empower the government to take children from their parents, they only know one way to do it, through force of law. It will end with armed officers of the law invading private homes to physically extract children that society says are not safe with parents who won't support trans ideology. That's where this is going. It's only a matter of time. If you and I want to argue about tax policy, or argue about the speed limit, or argue about how much it should cost to get a driver's license, we can argue about that till we're blue in the face. Or I might just roll over and say, it costs more than it should, but I'll put up with it. So not every ideological argument has to be resolved. Sometimes people will just knuckle under. But if you take an issue as important as the welfare of a person's children, if you remove parents' ability to reasonably debate this issue in the public space, to fight against legislation that is being proposed, to debate the issue with school boards, to file lawsuits against the government, if you remove people's ability for nonviolent disagreement, all that will be left is violent disagreement. I don't want that. And many people who agree with me don't want that either. But the left will not allow for the other side to even have a space at the table. Does he give any room at the table for someone with an opposing argument to be at the table and to debate? Civil discussion, the logical issues, the ramifications of the policies he's proposing. The fight against woke is strikingly similar to the fight the right previously waged against political correctness. It's an existential battle against allowing people to be awakened by reading novels and history, by attending plays, by watching and listening to actual news, through open discussion of privilege or systemic racism, or to use a different but related term, the underlying and nearly invisible structures of caste in America. It is a fight to stop people from talking about those social structures, or about the combination of religious zealotry and political ideology at work to foreclose women's bodily autonomy. That's a reference to abortion. It's a fight to prevent young people from expressing their sexual and gender preferences. That's the trans ideology pointed at minor children specifically. To make it more difficult for certain groups of citizens to vote. That's a veiled allusion towards voter ID and other voter verification methods being racist in their essence. To keep books that might make the most hypocritical and closed-minded evangelical Christian pastors uncomfortable off the shelves of public schools and libraries. That's saying that the school and the library staff should be able to trump parents' voices on what their children are exposed to. That's what that's saying. And usually, these things that create an issue are tied to cultural Marxism or trans ideology as aimed at children. All throughout this article, the author has presented his opponents as crazy, weak-willed followers of a cult, as obedient to the programming that society has put into them so that they become vapid adults who fail their way upwards if they fall within certain racial and caste designations. Here he's saying that people who oppose him are against bodily autonomy, who are attempting to oppress minor children, who are attempting to bow to the hypocritical and closed-minded evangelical Christian pastors. In other words, these people who might oppose these radical agenda books in public spaces are not principled people who disagree. They are Christian ideologues who are closed-minded. They're not firm in their convictions, they're closed-minded. And hypocritical. It's a fun word to throw in there because what you're saying is they can't possibly believe these principles and live them. They must be violating their own principles somewhere. All Christians are hypocrites. After all, if you have standards, you must be a hypocrite. I don't know how we unwind this mess. The fact that an article like this is taken seriously, how do I fight against this? I can sit here and I'm probably going to make 5 videos, probably one more video tomorrow. 5 videos dissecting one throwaway article from a piece of junk leftist rag. But the fact of the matter is, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or Salon or MSNBC, this video series has taught me that when I look at the things the left finds persuasive, I see this kind of programming. It's endemic, it's everywhere. One of the challenges with the modern media landscape is that those areas where readers and listeners have the most choice end up biased. The reason for that is because if you have an algorithm that responds to popularity, the things that get the most votes rise to the top. People who disagree with those things that rise to the top, the minority, the ideological minority, find themselves not represented in that discussion. So they go somewhere else. Because nothing's more frustrating than trying to contribute to a platform in a community where you're just shouted down or you're just ignored because the algorithm doesn't respond to you, because the people who engage with this algorithm respond to the things that are popular. It's a self-reinforcing problem as people self-select into a group of a tighter and tighter ideological bias. When I started this series, I was hoping that Reddit was actually a little more balanced, that I would have a chance to critique and engage with and discuss the philosophical underpinnings and the language tricks alike of left and right and independent. Those voices are out there. They're not on Reddit. Reddit is a community that is filled with people who agree with leftist talking points. And I know this because I read the comments on these articles. And these articles represent a viewpoint that is almost purely opposed to the things that I believe in and the principles I try and live. So I want to unpack them and figure out, all right, if you genuinely believe these things, and I think you're a good person, and I genuinely believe my opinions, and I think I'm a good person, then we must be disagreeing on something. How did we arrive at conclusions that are so far apart? Because if we're both engaging in good faith, we should generally come to the same conclusions. And it doesn't work like that. Probably worth a deep dive all on its own, but there are definitely some personality traits associated with political leaning. There's personal history. There's your outlook on life, your kind of metaphysical view of the world. There's the strength of your relationships. There's your personal prosperity. There's family pressure, social pressure, work pressure. There's church influence, if that's part of your life, or if that's not part of your life, perhaps you are running from something, maybe from your past or your raising, so you're looking for someone who endorses the opposite of the issues of the principles you were taught when you were a child because you've chosen to